Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to talk about some of the major turning points of the Civil War. We'll talk about some minor events around them, but there's kind of three major time periods and events that everything kind of shifted on. So let's get started. So real quick, just so we're all familiar, everything in red is part of the Confederate States of America, also known simply as the Confederacy, and the North referred to them as the rebels. Then you have everything in blue, which is part of the Union, or the United States. Now, the stuff in gray was disputed territory. So West Virginia asked to be part of the Union to break away from Virginia. Maryland was occupied by the military by the Union military, since the capital was right on the southern border of Maryland. We couldn't let that fall into Confederate hands. Kentucky had horses, so we had to occupy Kentucky to maintain control of horses. And Missouri was split about 50-50 between Union and Confederate supporters. So it too will be occupied by the Union Army. There's going to be a lot of infighting, guerrilla fighting in the state. Now, the battle that kicked off the war is the Battle of Fort Sumter in South Carolina, just outside of Charleston Bay. So, big fight. Basically, the Confederates attacked a Union fort when that Union fort did not surrender to the Confederate forces. This gave Abraham Lincoln justification. The Southerners shot first, so we can go to war. So you have a rebellion in the country. This all surrounds Fort Sumter. So the Union is putting together a strategy, and Winfield Scott, who we talked about during the Mexican-American War, is still around, although he'll die before the war is over, before the Civil War is over. He comes up with what's known as the Anaconda Plan. This is kind of a cartoon making fun of it, Scott's Great Snake. And his idea was we blockade the southern ports, so cut them off from trade. Then you encircle them. You launch several armies coming down from the north. You capture the Mississippi, split the Confederacy in half, and slowly squeeze and break apart the Confederacy. Now, a lot of people laughed at it at first, like, oh, it's going to take too long, the war will be over before this is necessary. But pretty quick, the Union realizes the war is going to be very long, and we need to start implementing Scott's plan. And this actually becomes the plan that other generals actually put into effect by the end of the war. So this is kind of the big move that the Union's making. Now, the Confederacy, they have a little bit different goal. They're betting on something else to win. Something called King Cotton diplomacy. So King Cotton diplomacy is the South is the largest producer of cotton in the world. They sell to Europe, particularly to England and to France for their textile production. And we have some of the cheapest, best produced cotton in the world. Now, what the Confederacy is betting is that if they withhold cotton from the world, basically cut off England in particular, that would force England to side with the Confederacy to fight the Union, because England would be so desperate for Confederate cotton. This proved not to be true. England was an empire. They just went to Africa, to India for other forms of cotton. They didn't need the South. They liked having the South, but they didn't need the South for their cotton. So this is going to backfire terribly on the Confederacy. They will not get foreign support, and that will lead to their ultimate demise. So the war is broken up into three theaters. So you have the Eastern Theater, which is basically everything kind of right over here. So mainly between the two capitals, between Washington and Richmond, Virginia. Then you have the Western Theater, which is kind of a misnomer, but it's kind of everything in this middle section. Then you have the Trans-Mississippi. So that's everything west of the Mississippi River. So mainly Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. So, and then Missouri to a lesser extent. But this is the Trans-Mississippi. So these are the three major theaters in which fighting happened. Although the most important things are going to happen in the Western and Eastern theaters. So the first major battle of the war is the Battle of Bull Run. Now you can see kind of in the picture all these guys wearing these funny different uniforms. When this first battle happened, most of the soldiers were more concerned about how they looked, because they thought this was going to be the only battle of the war, than if they were properly trained. So there's going to be a lot of problems. This shows huge deficiencies on both sides, both Confederate and Union. And it's going to prove to everyone that this war isn't going to be quick and easy and over by Christmas. It's going to take much longer. It's going to be harder fought, and it's going to last for quite a while. So the Battle of Bull Run, it's a huge embarrassment for the Union, but it's really an embarrassment for everybody. So kind of the lead up to the first big turning point, you have the 7 Days Battle of the Peninsula campaign. This is where one of the Union generals pushes his way down the bay to work his way up to hopefully capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. It doesn't go as well as he hopes, but it does have the result of putting Robert E. Lee in charge of the Confederacy. The Confederate general that was in charge of defending the Confederate capital of Richmond is wounded. Robert E. Lee fills that gap temporarily, and it becomes a permanent position. And his army, the Army of Northern Virginia, is going to become the primary army of the Confederacy. So Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia are the heart of the Confederate war effort. Now, many Southerners, and Robert E. Lee included, compared himself to George Washington. Robert E. Lee had married one of George Washington's adopted granddaughters, carried one of Washington's swords, named his horse after one of Washington's horses, Traveler, basically did everything he could to get as close to Washington as he could. And many other Southerners saw him as a Washington-like character because he's kind of this genteel, wealthy, planter kind of guy that's also fighting for, in their mind, the independence of a nation. So Washington fought for the independence of the United States. Lee is fighting for the independence of the Confederacy. So they see a lot of similarities in this, and we'll see this portrayed even after the Civil War. Now, Lee's first big move is to not just defend the South, which was the main goal of the Confederacy, was to keep the North out, but he gets bold and he decides he's going to go around Washington. So here's Washington, D.C. He's going to go around Washington, D.C. and attack into northern Maryland at a place called Sharpsburg along the Antietam Creek. So this big battle of Antietam is the beginning of the first major turning point. So this battle is going to escalate into the single bloodiest day of the war. Oh, there it is, popped up. So now the issue with this is when Robert E. Lee's army was maneuvering, trying to get into position, one of the officers dropped a pack of cigars with all of the orders for Robert E. Lee's army. A Union soldier found them, gave them to his officer, they made it up to the overall general. The general read them, McClellan, but he was overcautious and did not take action. So there's the letter with the orders. Now, by the time McClellan had moved into position, Robert E. Lee was already where he wanted to be. Because McClellan was overcautious, took too long to verify the information, it's going to lead to Robert E. Lee having time to build his defenses and prepare for the battle. Now, McClellan's going to make some serious mistakes. Instead of using his numerical superiority, he had about 60,000 more troops than Robert E. Lee. Instead of using his numbers to overwhelm Lee's smaller army, he attacks in piecemeal. He attacks first in the north in the morning, then he attacks in the middle around noon, then he'll attack in the south towards the late afternoon. But because he's only attacking in one section each time, Robert E. Lee is able to move his troops from, say, so if the attack's coming in the north, he can move some reinforcements from the south and the middle to reinforce. The one's coming in the middle, north and south reinforce. If it's coming from the south, everyone else gets to reinforce that. So, not a great strategy for the Union. Now, Robert E. Lee is able to use his inferior numbers in a far more strategic way than McClellan's able to use his superior numbers. Now, one of the biggest, bloodiest fights is going to take place in the southern area. And this is going to be Burnside. One of the supporting generals for the Union was a guy named Burnside. His job was to capture this bridge and attack the Confederate position. Now, instead of crossing the river and wading across in large numbers, he he basically ordered his army to cross a relatively narrow bridge. It was about 4 or 5 people wide. So as they were crossing, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. The Confederates could just slaughter these guys coming across. And after a hard fight, right as Burnside's men were about to capture the enemy position, Confederate reinforcements arrive. AP Hill, so these are Texas troops, arrive and begin fighting. And they're able to push the Union back, and this turns into a huge bloodbath, and it does not go well for the Union. Now, by the end of the day, McClellan's army has been pushed back at every point. Lee's army has held their ground at every point. So if you see these guys right here, McClellan has about 20 or 30,000 troops that haven't seen battle. They were in reserve all day that he hasn't even used yet. Lee's army is completely exhausted. However, Lee decides, okay, we beat him up, we dealt him damage, now we're going to retreat. This is kind of that first turning point. So Lee attacks, hits the Union hard, and then retreats, but McClellan chooses not to follow. This is the big thing. McClellan, even though he has troops that can chase down the enemy and hopefully pin them down and destroy the army, he chooses not to fight. And this is the problem with McClellan. He always chooses not to fight. If he has the choice, he waits to see if he can avoid a fight to save his army. Lincoln is furious that McClellan did not finish off Lee's army. So much so, he takes a train upstate to the actual Antietam battlefield, goes and visits McClellan, yells at him, and then fires him because he would not fight. And this begins Lincoln's big push to try to find a general who will fight for him. So the Battle of Antietam itself is the first major turning point. But as a result of the Battle of Antietam, we're going to get the Emancipation Proclamation. So this is the second half. So even though the Battle of Antietam was technically a loss for the Union, like strategically, Robert E. Lee retreated, so officially the Union won. So Abraham Lincoln says, okay, this is a kind of a position of power, so we're going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. We're going to set all the slaves in the Confederacy free, and wherever a Union army goes, we're going to free those slaves. So we're hoping to deprive the South of their labor resource in slaves. By this point, the Union blockade is growing, getting more robust. And right as the Union blockade is becoming pretty much airtight, the Southerners decide we're going to stop withholding cotton and we're going to try to sell it. But now they can't because the blockade is too strong. So this King Cotton diplomacy plan has backfired terribly. When they could have sold cotton, they chose not to. Now that they want to, the Union Navy is preventing them from doing so. So after several attempts at finding a general, eventually Abraham Lincoln will rest on George Meade, leading into the second major turning point of the war. So George Meade is a relatively short, calm, quiet guy, but a very skilled general. Now he is going to be the head general during the next major battle. This is the Battle of Gettysburg. So this is, if Antietam was the bloodiest single day in the war, Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle of the war because it lasts 3 days long. It starts off as an accident, the two armies bumping into each other, and Robert E. Lee's army and Meade's army just escalate. They both keep pouring troops in, and basically Robert E. Lee is going to make the same mistake McClellan did, attack in the north, attack in the middle, attack in the south. Instead of attacking in one big wave, he attacked piecemeal, and it goes very poorly. As a result of the victory at Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln comes and gives the Gettysburg Address, dedicating the field, the battlefield at Gettysburg, as a national cemetery. So the Western Theater. This is the second half of the turning point. So Ulysses S. Grant is going to eventually be Lincoln's fighting general, but he gets his start in the Western Theater. So he starts up in the north area and begins working his way down Fort Henry and Donelson, Shiloh, Then the big battle is going to take place along the Mississippi at a place called Vicksburg. So Vicksburg is the second half of the second turning point. Now, why it's the same as the Gettysburg one is because they're happening almost simultaneously. So right as Gettysburg is happening in the east, Vicksburg is happening in the west, and it's going to do two major things. So while Gettysburg is crippling Robert E. Lee's army, never again will his army invade the north. At Vicksburg, it's the final capture of the last piece of the Mississippi. Earlier, the Union had captured New Orleans. Now, when Grant's army captures Vicksburg, this is sealing off the Mississippi. Basically, the Confederacy is getting split in two, like Winfield Scott's plan had kind of foretold or designed. Now, this is a terrible, terrible battle. Basically, Grant is going to bomb and bombard the city back into the Stone Age. They literally dig caves into hill walls to escape the constant bombardment. So Grant utterly decimates Vicksburg and captures it. Now, the final push is going to lead to the third major turning point. So Grant gets moved east and becomes the commanding general over all Union armies. But the final turning point is the election of 1864. This will determine what the end of the war will look like. So George McClellan, that dishonored, discredited general, runs against Abraham Lincoln. Now McClellan thinks, oh, if I run, all the soldiers will vote for me. But McClellan was running on a platform of, I'll end the war no matter what. Whether it's a victory or a compromise, I'll get us out of this war. Lincoln said, I'll get us out of this war, but only through victory. After all these sacrifices, we're going to win. Now, many Americans, soldiers included, had been fighting for 4 years. They didn't want a compromise. They wanted a victory. So despite him thinking the soldiers are going to vote for McClellan, everyone pretty much voted for Lincoln. So you can see, it is resoundingly in favor of Lincoln. Now, as Lincoln was campaigning for his presidency, William Tecumseh Sherman, Grant's former second in command, who had now become the main guy in the West, had launched his own campaign. His campaign to invade the South. This is the Atlanta campaign. So he comes out of Tennessee, marches, fighting off Confederate armies to ultimately make it to Atlanta. And this Battle of Atlanta is a bloody, bloody battle. The city itself is virtually destroyed. It is a shell of what it once was. But right as the election was coming to fruition, and that November was coming around, Sherman writes a letter to the president, to Abraham Lincoln, saying, Dear Mr. President, I have an early Christmas present for you. I present to you the city of Atlanta. So this is going to be kind of the death blow for McClellan's campaign because Lincoln can say, we're winning. Look, we just marched an army into the South. General Sherman has captured Atlanta, one of the major southern cities. We are winning. It's a short time from absolute victory. Just, one more big push and we have this. And that was enough to push everyone to vote for Lincoln. But you can see the decimation after some of these battles. There's another shot of Atlanta. So Sherman's going to continue his campaign across the South, and it's going to be the March to the Sea. So 1864, you can kind of see how it went. So the popular vote was mildly close, but the Electoral College vote was resoundingly in favor of Lincoln. Now, after his successful re-election, Lincoln said, okay, we need to get an amendment passed abolishing slavery, this 13th Amendment. So if you ever watch the Lincoln movie, that's what that movie is all about, is getting that amendment passed. The final push to end the war is going to be the siege of the Confederate capital of Richmond. Grant's army fought their way from Washington, D.C. down to Richmond, latched on to Robert E. Lee's army, and never let go. He's like a bulldog holding on. So the siege began around Richmond, but the battle lines extended all the way down to Petersburg, and eventually Petersburg will be captured. And when Petersburg gets captured, Robert E. Lee tries to break out of Richmond and escape. But Grant predicts this happening, sends his newly recruited black units to go and cut off Lee's escape with a very particular purpose. Not only did he want to cut off his escape, but he wanted it to be the black troops that stopped Lee. Because it's one thing to capture the enemy army. It's another thing for the troops that are stopping the enemy's escape and forcing the end of the war to be the very troops that were the former slaves that the Southerners were fighting to keep. So not only is it an end to the war, but it's a message to the Confederate that your former slaves have ended this war. They have fought you, and they have been proven victorious. Robert E. Lee signs a surrender to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. All Lee asks is, give my men food, we'll turn in our guns, and then let them go home. And Grant agreed, and the war was effectively over. And because everyone saw Lee surrender, slowly all the other Confederate armies that were left began surrendering to the Union. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, tried to escape, hiding under a woman's shawl, from Richmond, but he got caught. And all the newspapers at the time had him dressing up as a woman, not just a shawl, but dressing up in a full dress to run away. Now, Lincoln's victory was short-lived because of John Wilkes Booth's assassination of Lincoln at Ford's Theater. So he snuck in behind Lincoln. Lincoln's guards were off drinking in celebration across the street, and Lincoln will be killed as a result of the assassination. Now, John Wilkes Booth jumps off the balcony, breaks his ankle, but before he runs off, he yells, "Sic semper tyrannis, death to tyrants." He runs, escapes, but just outside of Washington, D.C., he is captured and shot. So, a very limited victory for Booth. So here is a drawing of Lincoln on his deathbed, which is in a hotel right across the street from Ford's Theater. But this pretty much ended the war. So everything kind of in pink is Union. Everything in blue is disputed territory but held by the Union. Everything in green is conquered territory. And everything yellow was the remaining bits of the Confederacy at the end of the war. But with the surrender of Robert E. Lee, all the yellow slowly began to surrender, with Texas being the very last, finally on Juneteenth. That's why we celebrate Juneteenth in Texas. The Union Army arriving in Texas to force Texans to tell their slaves that they are free. But these were the three major turning points of the Civil War, and we'll stop there for today.